Well, good afternoon, everybody, and a warm welcome to this Cranmer Hall event. We're here in Durham, and there are a few of us in the room, and there's a good number of you online. The Bede Centre for Church Planting Theology, which is hosted here at Cranmer Hall, exists to tell the story of church planting by encouraging a conversation across the whole church. We do this through research, we do it through events like this one, and we do it through our teaching programmes at Cranmer. You can find out more about the Bede Centre by going to our website, cranmerhall.com/church planting theology. My name is Nick Moore. I'm the Warden of Cranmer Hall, and it's a great pleasure to be hosting this webinar. The Bede Centre also organises an annual conference, and next year's conference will be taking place the 6th to the 8th of July in Durham. The theme is power, and again, you can see if you go to our website and look for the conference, you'll be able to see that. This afternoon's webinar is the first in a series of webinars this academic year, which are exploring the theology of new churches, and you can see the programme on the slide there. You're very welcome to join us for future events, and if you'd like to receive a notification about those events, then you can sign up at cranmerhall.com/church planting webinars, and you'll join our mailing list. Today's seminar focuses on our most recent research, the communion dilemma, which you may have seen trailed in the Church Times last week with the headline, New Things Use Unauthorised Rights. There's nothing like journalistic balance for you, is there? But the research was entitled The Communion Dilemma, and it explores how new churches and worshipping communities in the Church of England might engage with Holy Communion. So this afternoon's webinar is going to take the form of a short summary of the report from the director of the Bede Centre, Reverend Dr. Joshua Cockayne, and followed by two responses from Reverend Rachael Phillips and Reverend Mark Earey, both of whom I'll introduce at that point. There'll then be space for maybe 20 or so minutes of questions for the three speakers. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Josh for a summary of the report.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. As Nick says, in this webinar, we're going to explore some of the recent research that we have just published at the Bede Centre and some of the conversations surrounding this. I thought I should just mention, as Nick has already done, perhaps the elephant in the room, perhaps the reason some of you come along to this webinar, which is there's been some discussion of this report online, which I think has been opened up some really fruitful conversations around the place of communion in the church, and particularly in the context of new churches and new worshipping communities. I just wanted to say, as an encouragement, that I'd really encourage you to read the report itself, as well as the coverage of that in the Church Times. My wife tells me that this headline makes me sound like a boring pedant that wants to go around to new churches and tell them all that they're doing liturgy wrong. But actually, if you read the report, very much the spirit of the research that we're doing is to ask how we can support the work of new churches and new worshipping communities, and particularly in this really crucial work of enabling them to be sacramental. So an encouragement to engage with some of the report itself, as well as some of the reporting that has featured the report. Let me say a few things about the context of this research, and then I'm going to give you a really quick overview. If you've read the report in detail, some of this won't be news to you, but hopefully it will refresh some of the discussion that it's had in this piece of research. The image that you'll see on the screen is of a piece of research which we published about 18 months ago through the Bede Centre, which was written by my predecessor in this role, Will Folger. It equally engaged a kind of a live conversation in the press around what's happening in the church nationally for very different reasons. I think to understand some of the work we've been doing in the communion dilemma, you have to kind of rewind to see some of the work that Will did in that report. One of the things that Will found and discussed at length in that report was that there's no one label that really expresses all of the different expressions of church in the Church of England today. Whereas 20 years ago, we might have had some more uniform language of fresh expressions of church. The picture today is slightly more complicated than that. And in fact, this research found that in all the dioceses, in the 11 dioceses that were being surveyed, there was barely any agreement in what to call new things in the diocese. So there's a complexity of terms which actually made this piece of research quite difficult to do, because when you ask a group of practitioners to reflect on their use of a certain practice, you have to be sure that you're asking the right people. In this research, we invited anybody who was leading some form of worship that wasn't traditional parish ministry to reflect on their use of communion. Now, there are lots of complicated things, knowing if we've got the right people and the right contexts. But just to say that when we're talking about the new things in this report, we're basically referring to anybody that's trying to offer worship outside of inherited parish structures in the Church of England. In the research that we looked at, there are about 63 contexts represented in this research. So as we say in the report, not a huge sample, and a lot more work would be needs to be done to show that these findings are true throughout the Church. But in fact, as we explored in the research, we used the data that was provided by these contexts, not necessarily to prove anything, but really to illustrate the wider discussion around the place of liturgy and sacraments in the Church of England today in new church contexts. And finally, just to say, as well as language of church and new worshipping community being difficult, knowing what to call the practice of communion also proved a difficulty for this research. Some people really didn't like the term Eucharist, for instance, when we engaged them, and said, if we use the term Eucharist, it will put off a whole load of practitioners that are engaging in new contexts. But equally, we're very aware that if we chose one label and not another, we're excluding whole traditions of the Church. So all of that, say, terminology and language plays a huge role in how we engage with this conversation. So let me tell you a little about the research itself. This report explores 3 different responses that could be taken to the practice of Holy Communion in the context of non-parochial forms of worship. And in brief, these 3 different options, which I think are exhaustive options, these are the 3 options that are faced by a practitioner when deciding to start a new church context. The best summary of the report I can give you is to say that we think none of these options is satisfactory in the current context. We don't think any of these options is really sufficient if we want to see a growth in new things and new worshipping communities across the Church. So let me take you through each of them. The first option is that in new church contexts or fresh expressions context, one option that practitioners face is not to celebrate the Eucharist at all. And in fact, my assumption when going into this research was that for most contexts, this would be the case. My surprise was to learn that actually very few contexts that we engaged with had never tried or never engaged with communion. In fact, only 9 of the 63 contexts I talked to had never practiced communion at all. So this idea that you find in some of the literature which says that new churches are not sacramental, that just doesn't appear to be true. Actually, most of the new contexts we talked to were trying to find ways to be sacramental and to practice communion. And of the contexts that didn't celebrate, a few different responses were given. And again, quite a mixed picture here. Some of them said it was a problem of accessibility, it didn't allow the context to be missional. But some of them had more practical worries, such as the priest is already leading 8 services. And so we didn't think it was fair to ask them to preside at another service. So we're quite a mixed set of responses for why people didn't celebrate. I think this is a really striking statistic and one of the key findings of the report, which is that in these new contexts, the leaders of these new contexts simply didn't accept the idea that communion made worship less accessible. In fact, most of them spoke very richly and at length about the ways in which communion was deeply connected to the mission of the Church and to mission in these new contexts. Okay, so that's the first option, which is don't celebrate the Eucharist at all. As we explore at length in the report, I don't think this is a live option for Anglicans, because I think deeply rooted in our ecclesiology is the idea that the Church is a gathering of word and sacrament. So it might be fine to start a discussion group. It might be fine to start a mission initiative that isn't sacramental. But if a community is to be thought of as a church, then at some point, I think it has to engage this question of how it is sacramental. Okay. The second option, which we considered, was to celebrate communion and to use authorized liturgical texts to do so. And perhaps it's not surprising to you, but this was the most common option, the people we talked to. Most people who were celebrating communion were using authorized forms of liturgy and were using texts from common worship to do so. As we explore in the report, it's difficult to fully grasp how accurate this data is, given that many of the people responding weren't confident of what counted as authorized liturgy. One of the respondents, for instance, said they were using authorized liturgies, and when asked which authorized liturgies, they responded they were using Celtic liturgies from the Iona community. So I think a good example of the fact there's some confusion around what counts as authorized liturgy in the Church of England, which will get us onto some of the suggestions later in the report. However, even though most contexts that we're celebrating were using authorized texts, more than half of them felt that the texts that they had, the texts that they were bound by canon to use for celebrating, didn't fit their context. And there were lots of different reasons given. Some of them reflected on how worthy these Eucharistic texts were in contexts with very different educational backgrounds and educational needs. Some of them talked about the middle class feel of Anglican Eucharistic liturgies, which just didn't engage deeply with the communities they were trying to serve. So lots of responses given, but reflections on why these texts might not always be suitable. The last option that I think new churches or new worshipping communities might take is that they could celebrate in an unauthorized way. That is, they could use their own texts. They could significantly adapt texts. They could write texts for contexts. And around 30 to 40% of the contexts we engaged with were doing this, using heavily adapted liturgies that weren't authorized by the canons of the Church of England to celebrate, which is, I guess, where the Church Times gets their headline that I am very against new contexts using unauthorized liturgies. And the reality is that there's some truth in the headline, in the sense that I think one of the deep problems with this way of responding to the challenge is that it really cuts off new context from the wider church. As an Anglican, as Anglicans, we believe that the local congregation doesn't exist in isolation. And I think one of the risks of creating new liturgies for contexts, apart from the breaking of canon law and the breaking of the Declaration of Assent, is also this deeper problem, which is that it cuts the congregation off from the wider ecology of the church. And both, I think both suffer from that. Both the congregation and the wider church suffer when there is not an engagement, there's not a dialogue between the context and the wider church. Okay, so they're in brief the three responses which the report explores, and I think I've given you some indication of why I think all three of them are not really satisfactory. Let me, before we hand over to Rachel, let me just sum up three options that the report explores for thinking about how we might adapt, how we might move forwards with this process. The first one is that we might ask some more serious questions about whether the liturgies and the liturgical process that we have is fit for purpose for today's church. And in fact, there's some precedent for doing so. In the last decade, new liturgies have been written for celebrating the Eucharist in contexts in which large numbers of children are present, and those Eucharists, those liturgies have been, I think, quite successful and have been engaged with widely through the Meti-Church movement. So some precedent for adapting and adding liturgies through authorized systems. And there's also, I think, a need, and we say this in the report, for a deeper reflection on whether the processes we have liturgically enable us to flourish as a church. And all I'll say about this is that I think if you want a detailed exploration of these questions, I think Mark Earey's work, who's Mark's going to be speaking to us shortly, Mark explores these questions in significant detail in his book, Beyond Common Worship. And I think I highly commend that as a text, which explores some of these questions. And the second recommendation suggestion that we have in the report is that we seek to learn from contexts where creativity is already happening. And this really is a response from the worry about our ecclesiology becoming fragmented or congregational. And the suggestion is simply that we find ways of creating spaces which creativity can happen and which the Church of England, the wider church, can learn from those contexts. So our hope is that if we were to ask questions about liturgical reform, adding more liturgies, that we do so in a way that's connected to context and to practitioners who are trying to do this well and faithfully in context. And the last thing that we reflect on in the report is the need for more training. And I say this as an academic dean of a theological college. So this is a very live question for us. But more broadly in the church, I think there are questions about whether we train people well to be able to engage deeply. I think one of the things that's really striking from the report and engaging with the practitioners is not that they don't have the resources, but sometimes they don't know how to use the resources well. And so actually, I think training is a significant part of the picture. Okay, I think I'm over my 10 minutes, so I'm going to hand back to Nick, and then we're going to move on to our respondents.
Josh, that's great. Thank you very much for that helpful summary of the report. We now move straight on to Rachael. Rachael Phillips, Reverend Rachael Phillips, is the leader of Magdalen Community Church, a church plant in Chopwell here in the northeast of England, which meets outdoors and focuses on building community around food and nature. MCC celebrates Holy Communion in Chopwell Woods every Friday lunchtime and twice a month on a Sunday lunchtime. And the cover of the Communion Dilemma report is taken from one of MCC's regular communion services. Rachael, it's great to welcome you, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Nick. Yeah, it made me smile so much seeing our chalice and our tree stumps that we use as our altar. So that was wonderful. What I'm going to do with my 10 minutes is I'm going to explain a little bit about our context, because as a practitioner on the ground who certainly does not have the accolades that Mark does, and and Mark's input is going to be very different from mine, I imagine. But what I can bring is what it's like for us on the ground as a new worshiping community right here and now, and how we're interacting with this, and my perspective of the research that you've done. So I'm going to explain a little bit about our context, and then I'm going to pose a few of my own questions for potential future research or things we might be pondering as a community together. But first, a quote from the research that really resonated with me. We believe God is calling us towards a revitalized parish system within which new and inherited worshipping communities flow together. Oh, yes, absolutely. I loved reading this. I don't think it should ever be either or. I don't think one should be favoured above the other, or that new worshipping communities, new things would be seen as in competition with what's already there. And what I read in that bit of the report really echoed a lot of Will Folger's book, Present in Every Place. So it's really, really good to read that. And I would say that our context, we fit within that 74% of people who celebrate communion at least monthly or weekly. And many of these contexts only gathered monthly, so celebrating it at every gathering. Yes, as Nick's already said, that is what we do. At our every worship gathering, we have communion. Communion was described as integral to the church's life and identity, and deeply connected to its understanding of mission. Yeah, absolutely. That is where we are. That's what we feel about Holy Communion. So of the three possible responses, Magdalen Community Church definitely sits within two. And this felt the only possible route, really, because I'm an Anglican priest. So the other options just didn't seem that they were even available to me, unless I'm misunderstanding something. It was always going to be a church with Eucharist at its centre, because we're Anglican. So word and sacrament are what we're about. So the role of communion within MCC, well, it was a really deep desire of mine from the beginning that it would be central to our worship. And we're a church that meets around food, and the fact that our flagship Sunday and also our Fridays are, but our Sundays mainly, they're called the feast. So the service is called the feast. And that's because we cook and we eat together. And we're not just remembering the Last Supper, but we're also looking ahead to celebrate with Jesus at the feast in heaven. So the Eucharist was always going to be part of the plan. And being Anglican, we do benefit from the wisdom and the historical tradition of our ecclesial roots. And what is probably important to tell you is something about our demographic. So the people who make up our new thing, Magdalene Community Church, God sent us quite the variety. So we have people among us who come from a Baptist tradition, Methodist, Free Church, one or two from a Roman Catholic tradition, a small portion of Anglicans, and people who are de-churched, who've experienced church trauma and want to forget all about their previous experiences, and those who are brand new to faith. So quite the melting pot. And we are also a church that God has sent a lot of neurodivergent people to. So we are, in our inherent makeup, people who ask questions, who don't necessarily take the given standard as something to accept, but do a lot of kind of picking at things and taking apart things and wondering, is this what we want? Is this okay? This is really important, that this is who God has sent us, and it has really shaped how we interact with Anglicanism as a thing. And one of the priests who lead MCC, it was really important that I understood for myself what I believed about Holy Communion, and to be able to communicate that with the community. So wrestling with questions like, what even is church? What is a priest? What is communion? What's it for? Are things that were very much part and parcel of our first few months and years. We're only 2.5 years old, so we're still pretty new. So yeah, it's fair to say that we have a high percentage of people suspicious of or altogether dismissive of Anglicanism. Yet the Holy Communion is absolutely central. Both those things are true. Holy Communion is central to what we do. Also, MCC exists within a parish that is forward in faith, also known as a society parish, or a parish with resolutions. And so we couldn't celebrate communion at first because I wasn't allowed to celebrate within the church building that already existed as a woman. But also, we're an outdoor church, and you're not allowed to celebrate communion outside of a church building. So unless you have a special permission from the bishop. So we had to get both a permission for me to exist at all outside of the building, even though it's forward in faith, but also for us to be able to preside, for me to preside in the woods or anywhere. Anywhere I'm allowed to preside anywhere, as long as it's not in the building, but within the parish boundaries, which is really good because actually it's meant that I could preside in my own home. My goodness, what a privilege that is. So yeah, that's a bit about our context. So the Bishop of Durham presided at our first ever communion service, and that was 8 months after we were born. We have a simple setup in the woods now. It's moved from monthly to weekly, and then we've just changed one of our other Sunday gatherings to Eucharistic as well. So we're constantly increasing our number of Eucharistic services. And we've found that our deeply liturgical services are the fastest growing, like the numbers are the greatest and the fastest growing in anything that we do, which is, well, a bit surprising, but really wonderful. So what it's offered is countless encounters with people who are coming to our community, who are experiencing an invitation to communion for the first time in their lives. Being the priest who is able to offer this has been just wonderful. Seeing people's stories of faith and healing that are possible because of the Eucharist is has been a real journey for us. So what about the liturgy? Well, one of the respondents said in the research that the liturgies are jarring with the rest of the content. And this is the available liturgies that we have. So MCC, we use only the authorized liturgies because I made my promises when I was ordained and stick by them. But it says in the research, to stand up and read 700 words of formal liturgical prose in such a context is bound to feel alien. I don't doubt that in some contexts that is absolutely true, and the leaders of those contexts know their people best and hold to that opinion. But what I want to say is that I don't agree that that's how we experience it. So whilst we sit in group 2, number 2 option, actually, I think that the available liturgies that the Church of England has offered us through our heritage are enough for us at MCC. Now, our worship is intentionally really relaxed, and because of the high number of neurodivergent people among us, we're really committed to being inclusive. Everything is opt-in, and the environment that we create probably doesn't look like a regular church service. I mean, some of you have been, I can see from the names that some of you are either part of MCC or visited. But when it comes to the Eucharist, I wouldn't use the word jarring. I would say that the liturgical shift that we see is really helpful. So we've gone from being really conversational, and there's discourse, there's different voices contributing to our worship. I often don't have shoes on. I will stand in the centre of our gathered area, unless the fire's there in the winter, but we have a sort of a gathered area with logs. But when it comes to the Eucharist, there's a liturgical shift. And yes, we use those words that might, for some, are really formal, but for us, it signifies, and I communicate this, I'll explain, this is why we're doing it. And I talk to our kids and our adults, and I'll say, this is why I'm putting my stole on. And this is why we commissioned these special chalices to be made, especially for us, and the beautiful wooden box that they're contained in that we call the tabernacle. This is special stuff, and that's why you can sense the shift, because the Eucharist is the highlight of our service. And so I don't feel that the liturgies are lacking. We use Prayer D, and for us it works great. I'd love for us to explore some other prayers as time moves on, but Prayer D works for us well at the moment. So later on in the research, I thought it was interesting to, that's my bit about MCC and like how we do it. I'd love to answer any questions that you have at the end when we go into group discussion. But it was interesting in the research that you covered kind of when is a church not a church, and the Anglican understanding of what church is. If it does not gather around the word of God in scripture and practice of the sacraments of baptism and communion, it is simply not a church, was one of the quotes. And yeah, I couldn't agree more. It was helpful to note that some of the churches that were, some of the new things rather, that were asked in the research, that who aren't celebrating Holy Communion, it might just be a not yet, but with a view to get there. And that was really encouraging for me to read. I'm really pleased to hear that, because getting there is, whenever that happens, is an aim. And it was certainly like that for us as well. You know, we didn't start with Holy Communion, but it took us 8 months to get there, and for some it will take a little longer. But I do agree that it's not so much for some it's not so much the sacrament itself that's a problem, it's the red tape around it. And so who is allowed to receive, and issues around baptism and confirmation. I think that even if the text isn't the barrier, some of the other issues around it can be. And for those that don't celebrate, it was interesting to read that sacramental worship is, a reason given is that sacramental worship is already being given elsewhere in the parish. I don't really get that. Like, yeah, I do. I see that it's already happening, and so you can technically tick that box. But I can't imagine ever wanting to be a church in our own right, doing all the things that church do, but saying, well, up the road in the village, they're already doing that. So if you want that, then go there. Like, why as a community would we not all want to be sharing it together in amongst all of our other worship and everything else that we do in our shared life together as a church? So I didn't really understand that, but clearly for some, that is an important factor. And then, yeah, one more quote that I really enjoyed, and then I'm going to just sort of pose my questions. If the edges are not allowed to renew the centre, then those leading new things are being set up to fail, and the wider church will not benefit from their ministry. Yes, can we say that again? I'm not going to say it again. It's written down. But let's read that again and let's really take that in. If anyone is at the centre on this call, then yeah, please like take this to heart. Like yes, we absolutely need renewal at the centre from the edges. And the idea that some new things might be designated as centres for liturgical experimentation, my eyes lit up when I read that. How exciting. So yeah, my overall response to the research, I'm reassured that these questions are being asked, that you're actually approaching people on the ground and leaders in these new things. I feel seen because I was unsure at first. I didn't know, what am I allowed to do with this new worshipping community? Well, it turned out that it hadn't even been worked out by the Church of England. So that was reassuring. It wasn't like a module I'd missed in training because I trained at Cranmer Hall, so you guys would be responsible anyway. My two questions are, if contexts choose to not celebrate, is it really an Anglican church? Which raises the question about curates starting new worshipping communities with no provision for ongoing leadership by ordained priests after their curacy ends. So if the Eucharist is such a big deal, then what do we do about those leaders when they have to move on because their curacies end? Why are they setting something up if it's not going to be continued to be led by a priest? And which leads to a bigger question of what is the role of a priest in a new worshipping community? Is a priest reduced to just somebody who can lead a Eucharist service and then you can just bring them in and out? Or is a priest so much more than that? I would argue that they are. That's all from me. I wasn't timing myself, so apologies if I've gone over. But yeah, over to you.
That's great. Rachel, thank you so much. We turn now to Mark Earey, Reverend Mark Earey, who is Director of Anglican Formation and Tutor in Liturgy and Worship at Queen's Foundation in Birmingham. And from January, he'll be Tutor in Mission and Ministry at Ripon College, Cuddesdon. Mark is a very experienced liturgist and theologian, previously a member of the Church of England's Liturgical Commission, currently a consultant to it. His book, Beyond Common Worship, explores questions of Anglican identity and liturgy, and his work has significantly informed the discussion that can be found in the report. So, Mark, it's a delight to welcome you, and over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I want to do two things. I'm going to think a little bit about how we ended up in this situation, because I think that will help us think a bit about how we might dig ourselves out. And then I want to respond to the three suggested practical outcomes that are at the end of the report. First, though, I just want to say how refreshing it is to see this report. I think it's absolutely brilliant. It's great to see some up-to-date research that builds on earlier stuff that's been done by the Church Army, but it's particularly exciting to see a Centre for Church Planting considering this question about Holy Communion as a first-order question rather than a sort of add-on worry that we tack on at the end, which is often how it's been thought of. So I think it's great. So how did we get here? How did we find ourselves in this dilemma situation? Because I think that's absolutely the way to describe it. I want to suggest it's partly at least to do with several accidents. By which I mean things that you couldn't really do much about. They're just how things are, but which if we understand them, we might be able to see what we can do to address them. The first one is simply a chronological accident, and that is simply that Common Worship came out in the year 2000 and Mission Shaped Church, the big report that has reshaped the Church of England thinking about this, came out in 2004. Just imagine they'd come the other way round in a counterfactual historical narrative, which one day in retirement I might write. Imagine that the Church of England had got all excited about mission-shaped stuff in 1996, and that had then completely shaped how the liturgical revision that led up to Common Worship came. I mean, that would have been a very different world. And it's not that someone stopped that happening, it's just it didn't happen. It's an accident. So I think, in other words, the new missional thinking arrived at just the point where Synod was exhausted by a long liturgical revision process. So nobody got the energy at that point to suddenly go, oh, yay, let's throw the liturgy back up in the air and think about it all over again. So that's my first accident. The second accident is what I think I want to think of as a sort of church tradition accident. When the Anglo-Catholic slum priests in the late 19th century did their church planting, effectively, they did it with inherently sacramental understandings and naturally put the Mass, the Eucharist, at the very centre of what they were doing. Much of the energy for the various new things, and the report really helpfully recognises that there is a range, has in our own day come from the more evangelical part of the Church of England. And although it's not true that no evangelicals care about the sacraments, and that's very obvious, it is nonetheless true that quite a lot of evangelicals care less about the sacraments than most more Catholic members of the Church of England. And therefore, when they think about a new church, I mean, it was lovely to hear Rachael saying, I'm an Anglican, I'm doing a new thing. Obviously, it should involve the Eucharist. I don't think that's everybody's experience that's involved in new things. So I think there's a sort of accident there that means that even those evangelicals or those less evangelical folk who are doing new things, and there are some, there's a kind of evangelical pragmatism that nonetheless hangs around this whole process of new things, by which I simply mean the key question, and I think it's a good one, is this good, is this helpful, and does it work, rather than is this legal or is this consistent with the church's wider tradition. So evangelicals just instinctively ask different questions, or assume that liturgy is not going to work. And it was, again, really helpful to hear Rachael picking up on some of that. So that's my second accident, something to do with church tradition and where the centre of gravity is in new things. The third thing is what I call a process accident, which is simply the really obvious thing once you think about it, which is that anyone who's got energy and enthusiasm and joy for these kinds of new things is probably not going to be attracted to being on General Synod. And so therefore, the people who have the energy to make this thing happen are not the people who are involved in the processes that need to change in order to change the rules and make it better and so on. So that kind of lack of enthusiasm means that you haven't got the right people in the right place. And then finally, in terms of these kind of accidents, is what I think of as a sort of church culture accident, which is just where is the energy and what feels sexy in the church at the moment. And I have to say to you, liturgy is not it. It nearly was around the year 2000 when everybody wanted to know what to do about common worship, but it isn't anymore. And you can see that when you just look at theological colleges and courses that are training ordinands and lay readers and LLMs and so on, and other pioneer ministers. You know, what staff do they have and what are the labels? You can count the number of places like that are training people that have a designated liturgy tutor on the fingers of about 3 fingers. Whereas when I trained for ministry in 1860, which was also at Cranmer Hall, every theological college, including the evangelical ones, had a liturgy tutor, because it was just assumed that because we were training Anglican priests, of course, they needed to know about liturgy. Whereas nowadays, you don't need to know about liturgy because the worship band will deal with that stuff. And all you need to know about is other stuff. So like leadership and vision and evangelism. And you'll find there's plenty of tutors and posts advertised for those kinds of roles in colleges today. So therefore, the conversations are happening about these new things, and liturgy isn't on the radar until it's too late. So that's my kind of how have we got here. And then just to finish, to address the 3 things that the report suggests as possible ways forward. And it's great that the report is trying to do this. And the great thing is that it's basically saying, stop ignoring the elephant in the room. So I'm all for that. So the first response the report suggests is engage more seriously in the liturgical process and revision. And I think that is absolutely what needs to happen. It needs people who have the vision for the new things to give some time and energy to changing the framework. And that probably means sitting in General Synod a bit. But if we do that, then we can begin to shape what that might look like. And I've said at much greater length what I think that could look like in my book Beyond Common Worship, which is essentially about the Church of England's centre trusting local ministers much more with this stuff. The second thing that the report suggests is that we designate some new things as centres for liturgical experimentation. And we heard how excited Rachael was about that. I agree it would be great. I think I just want to throw in a little bit of realism there, which is that in itself would actually require changes to the Church of England's rules. The Church of England has some provision for testing of experimental liturgies, but they all assume a top-down model. So the House of Bishops asked the Liturgical Commission to write some new stuff, and they do, and then it is tested experimentally, and that feeds back into the centralized process. Actually, what we're talking about here is something much more context focused and context driven, the experiment that comes out of the exciting kind of places that Rachel was describing. So I don't want to say I don't think it's a good thing. I just want to sort of warn you, it's not a quick win, but could be a win. We just need to work at it. And thirdly, we need to provide more serious theological training for thinking about liturgy in new things. Amen. Preach it. All of our training of lay and ordained ministers needs to include this, particularly our training of pioneers needs to do this. When some respondents to the research didn't know what counted as authorised liturgy, we realised that we got ourselves in a bit of a pickle. So we definitely need that education. We need people partly to learn where the flexibility is, because people often just think, oh, authorised liturgy, there's no flexibility, therefore I have to use something from Iona or New Zealand or my head, whereas actually it's a lot more nuanced than that. So we could do with a bit more education along that. But the education we really need is that education that helps people get liturgy in their bones. And it's the kind of stuff that I think, we could hear Rachel, it lives in her. She's got an idea for what liturgy could look like. And she can see that it's not just about what the words are, it's about how I do the words and what context we're doing them in, and whether we're all sat in rows looking at the front or whether we're all gathered in a circle, how we use music. All of those things affect how engaging liturgy can feel. And you don't know that until you get it really, really deeply in your bones. So that's the kind of education we need, so that will give people confidence to work with the liturgy that we've got. Like every good jazz musician has to know their scales. They have to know the kind of how music works. Then they can improvise really creatively. So that's what we really need to do. And if I had one other thing to say in my last 15 seconds, it would be, if you care about this, don't be passive aggressive. In other words, don't kind of complain but do nothing. Get involved. That would be brilliant. Thank you.
Mark, that's wonderful. Thank you so much to all three of our contributors. We've got just shy of 15 minutes for questions now. Can I encourage you, if you're here in the room, we've got a roving mic, so just put a hand up and I'll call on you if you've got a question. If you're online, you can either type the question in the chat and I'll just draw attention to it, or you can put your hand up and then I will call on you to speak your question. Could you keep your questions short and could you direct them to one of our three panelists? That would be great. So the floor is open. Yes, we'll take one in the room here first. Pontus.
Yes, thank you very much. This question is for Josh. A wonderful webinar, and I haven't had a chance to read the full report, for which I do apologize. I am wondering, I'm sorry for this question being maybe not a wholly formed one either. Is there any suggestion, or has any other research been done on whether a lack of use or respect for the authorized liturgy, forgive my phrasing there, is related to, I think at least anecdotally it can be said that many evangelical and charismatic Anglicans in recent decades have less sense of their Anglican identity than perhaps they would have had 50 years or a century ago. Is there a suggestion that that may have contributed to that? Thank you.
Thank you, Pontus. So the quick answer is I'm not aware of any research that answers your question. I think anecdotally we've seen some of this play out, and I think Mark's comments, particularly about the accident of tradition, are really helpfully help to illustrate a response to that question, which is a huge number of new initiatives have come out of a more pragmatic evangelical tradition. Now, don't hear me wrong, there are plenty in the evangelical tradition that have a very strong sense of Anglican identity. There are also many who perhaps don't, and I think that's so I think that does play into the question that you're asking. I don't have any up-to-date research that answers that, but I think absolutely the sense of Anglican identity is deeply connected to that question. So thank you.
Great. We've got two questions in the chat, which I think we can take together. They're both directed to you, Josh, but they're both about lay leadership. So Andy Weir asks, do you have any idea of how many of these new things were lay-led? And it would be fascinating to know more about experience of lay leaders. And then Raywin Whiteley asks, states that in the context of Cumbria, many new worshiping communities are lay-led, and asks if there's any insight on the difference between clergy-led and lay-led contexts.
Yeah, I don't have the figures off the top of my head. I could get them to you if you email me. There was a mixture in this research of so the question I asked who presided, and as you saw in the slides, only two contexts admitted to using a non-ordained person to celebrate the Eucharist. And then after that, it asked whether the celebrant was the main leader of the context or somebody that was brought in externally. I don't have the figures off the top of my head. If somebody else speaks for a couple of minutes, I could probably find them fairly quickly and put them in the chat. But it was quite a small section of those contexts. I think about half of the contexts, maybe 60% of the contexts, were contexts like Rachel's, where you have an ordained person leading a new worshipping community. I think some of this question plays into Rachel's question, which is, why might a respondent say, we offer Eucharist in the parish already, and so we should go there? And I think the answer is partly that we don't have a very clear theology of what new worshipping communities are. For some contexts, new worshipping communities are just new mission initiatives that the parish is putting on. There's no desire for those things to become standalone communities. And I think it, in some ways, is quite unhelpful to group those together with the kind of community that you're trying to build in Chockwell, Rachel, which is a standalone church community that has actually most of your church have almost nothing to do with the rest of the parish or the parish church. So that, I think the distinction we don't really have there in our terms, in our ecclesiology. So yeah, I can get you the data there if people are interested in which ones were lay-led.
That's great, Josh. Thank you. And you tapped in there to a distinction that's made in a question asked by Simon Taylor, which is precisely that, new things like Rachel's Magdalene Community Church, which sees itself as a church, and others which might be a sort of an additional thing within a parish. Mark, can I draw you in? Is there anything you might say to that distinction?
Only that I think it's a really helpful distinction, and I think that's one of the report really helpfully pulls out this shift in terminology, and I think in many ways the move away from the fresh expressions kind of focus that it always had to be a separate church in the making has really helped more parishes to engage in this stuff. But it does make a difference then, I think, because if people think that communion could be available in other places, it might make them less keen, anxious to make sure it's included in what's going on in the new thing. So I think it is a really key distinction.
That's great. Thank you. Next question from Claire Morrish to you, Rachel. How do you deal with the red tape matters? Baptism, confirmation, admission to communion. Are all welcome to take communion or not?
The very short answer is all are welcome to take communion at our church. I do not want to create any barriers for someone who comes to me with their hands open and wants Jesus. I make it very clear what it is we're embarking on. What is it we're part of? What is this meal and how important is it? So I think some of the issues around going through a process of confirmation preparation is so that the end state is that you better understand what it is you're receiving, and you're growing in your faith, which I think is absolutely to be applauded. But I also know that there are lots of members of our community for whom such preparation would be perhaps beyond them, and there are younger people who, or there could be cases of people who are non-verbal communicators or have all sorts of different disabilities. for whom confirmation preparation wouldn't be appropriate, and I don't want to deny them the opportunity to be part of this free gift from Jesus. That's the answer that I have. But I would be, I don't think that you should solely have Holy Communion and not be baptized. And anybody who wishing to receive Holy Communion, we will be having a conversation about baptism, about why, about taking that step in their faith as well. I don't think that it should be one or the other.
That's great, thank you. And I'm just seeing we're getting some overlapping questions here, but there's another question for you, Rachel, which is pushing back towards the question of how you and the Society Parish Church have interacted. Has there been any kind of interaction or benefit in both directions?
Yeah, definitely. We've worked really hard on our relationship from the beginning to make sure that we are able to mutually flourish. The Society Parish understand that we're such a different church from them, that both can coexist really happily. There are no people who come to MCC who would otherwise probably feel like we're not poaching anyone who would be going to the Society Parish. And likewise, anybody who really desires that kind of worship probably wouldn't also want to be with MCC. We're so different, it works really well. We have such a good relationship that they have recently opened up their building to us so that we can have our youth group and children's group there over the winter. We're holding a week of prayer in their church building at the end of November to pray about the future of our church as I move on from curacy. So we have a really, really good relationship with the Society Church, and they've been to our worship, and they support us in what we do, which I'm really grateful for.
That's great, thank you. Another one for you, Mark, from Raywin Whiteley. She says, it strikes me that two of the challenges for liturgical innovation is both the diversity of contexts and the poor training of the leaders, which you've all touched on. So how can we bring together these people, leaders of new communities, liturgical experts, and the kind of poets who can write amazing liturgy?
I think that's a really good insight. So if we were, in our dream world, to set up these centres of liturgical experimentation, I hope that would also come with a whole group of other people who can join that conversation and resource them. So those with wider liturgical experience as well as other experiences might be brought into the conversation, including those with gifts for writing liturgical stuff. Although my slight caveat is that's not always the poets. Poets are often writing very individual texts that express their own thoughts. They don't always write stuff that is usable by everybody else. But I absolutely get the point there about those gifts of rich imagery and so on.
Mm-hmm. That's great, thank you. Josh, we've got a question from Ray. I know you've given a very brief answer in the chat, but the question is about whether you encountered any open table or LGBTQI orientated new things, and whether there's any thoughts on how authorised liturgy, liturgical flexibility might help in those contexts.
Yeah, thank you. And as I put in the chat, there is, we did engage with the Open Table Network when we gathered the research and talked to them about what we're doing. Some of the responses, of course, I can't tell which responses came from which contexts because all the data is anonymized. But certainly the question of how inclusive our liturgies are and how gendered our liturgies are was one of the themes that came through, particularly from folks that might be using heavily amended liturgies or writing their own liturgies. So that was a significant theme. And I think one of the things that was helpful to me in seeing that was I think sometimes when we have a conversation like this, the assumption might be that it's one tradition or one part of the church that's driving the conversation. But I think actually what's been interesting about this research is that there are this problem, I think, or this dilemma is being found in lots of different contexts and traditions, and there are different problems arising. And so actually the problem of accessibility and the problem of inclusivity are, might be distinct problems, but they have a common source there in the kind of rigidness of our approach to liturgy and the text that we have. And so, yeah, I think that was a really helpful, that was a really helpful insight. If I could just quickly pick up on Mark's point, if that's all right, Nick. on and the previous discussion as well, I think one of the things I want to emphasize is about the 3 responses in the report is, and I think Mark highlighted this very well, you need all 3 of them together if it's going to work. So if you do liturgical reform without paying attention to context, I'm not convinced you solve the problem, because you just change things, but you don't actually pay attention to the context that are learning things. And equally, if you train people without paying attention to the context, then you don't know what to train them for. So the idea of the 3 responses is supposed to be, we need to do all of these things in order to address this issue. And if we do 1 or 2 of these 3 things, then I think there'll still be some quite significant issues remaining.
Yeah. Thank you, Josh. Okay, I think we've probably got time for one final comment. I think, is it Charles Reed? You've got your hand up and you put a comment in the chat if you want to unmute and ask a question.
Yes, I think I was unmuted. This is a thought for Mark, really. And I was one of the people that helped to write the Eucharistic prayers in common worship. We did do it predating Mission Shaped Church, as he said, but we were trying to produce texts that were flexible, and we could another time have a discussion as to how successful we were in making the texts flexible. But I wonder whether one of our problems is that there's a lot of good ideas and good practice out there for using the text more flexibly, but it's just not getting shared very much. And whether a quick win, if the quick win can't be the liturgical experimentation places, but whether a quick win might be helping the good practice to be shared a bit more widely.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. We definitely need to do that. And we can do that both in terms of practice that's already happening and helping people to see the things they might not even have spotted themselves, because I think there is flexibility. And we've also heard from Rachel that in the hands of someone who knows what they're doing, that flexibility can be used really effectively. But we do need to find ways to make that more possible. Maybe a Grove booklet or something would help with that.
Excellent. Great. Well, we're at time, so we need to bring this to a close. Let me finish us with a prayer. Obviously, if you need to go, then you can just drop out of the room. But let me close us with a prayer. Lord God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we praise you that you'll call your people to gather, to worship, and to witness. We thank you for new things and for old things in the church. And we pray that you would supply the every need of new churches, that you would guide us as a church to be imaginative and faithful in our celebration of communion, that it might truly be a means of grace to your people and to the world. In Jesus' name, amen.